Now you're going to have an opportunity to look at some sentences in English and determine what the correct form of the relative pronoun will be. I'll guide you through a couple of them, and then you'll be working on your own. And now I'd like to tell you about the relative pronoun being used as the object of the preposition cum. Just like the pronouns ego and tu in their ablative forms, the relative pronoun will have cum attached to the end of it to create the words quocum, quacum, and quibuscum. Look at it here in this sentence. The women with whom I was walking did not know the path to the city. Quibuscum, with whom. Pay attention to that as we move forward. Here's your first sentence. Find the relative clause and then think about what the antecedent of the relative pronoun is and what the gender and number of the antecedent is. Pause the video while you look for those items. You should have noted that the relative clause begins with whose and ends at forests. The antecedent of whose is God's. God's is masculine and plural. Within the relative clause, whose is showing possession. I know this because whose is the possessive word of who, whose, or whom. Now pause the video while you take a few moments to find or write the correct form of the relative pronoun for this sentence. The correct form of the relative pronoun is quorum, because quorum is plural and masculine like its antecedent God's, and it needs to show possession. In this next sentence, your task is the same. Find the relative clause in English, locate the antecedent of the relative pronoun, determine the gender and number of the antecedent, and also determine what the relative pronoun is doing in its own clause. Pause the video while you think about those things. In this sentence, the relative clause is with whom my daughter used to play. Although whom is usually going to begin the clause, we have to understand that if a preposition comes in front of it, the relative clause will begin with the preposition. The antecedent of whom is girls. Girls is feminine and plural, so my relative pronoun will also be feminine and plural. Whom is the object of with, and because with takes the ablative case, my relative pronoun will need to be ablative. Pause the video while you find the correct form of the relative pronoun from your chart. The correct form of the relative pronoun is quibus. If that's all you wrote, that's fine. But remember, as the object of the preposition with, you really should be writing quibuscum, because that's how it will appear in Latin. This is your third sentence and the last one which I will guide you through. Your first task is to find the relative clause, then focusing on the relative pronoun, find the antecedent. Think about the gender and number of the antecedent. Then go back to the relative pronoun and think about how it is being used in its own clause. The relative clause in this sentence is on which many thieves are hiding. Remember that if there is a preposition in front of the relative pronoun, the relative clause must start with the preposition, the antecedent of which is road. Road is singular and feminine. Because which is the object of the preposition in, and in requires the ablative case, my relative pronoun will be in the ablative case. Now pause the video while you find the correct form of the relative pronoun on your chart. The correct form of the relative pronoun is qua. If you wrote in space qua, you are correct also. If you felt that you should include the preposition in front of qua because it is part of a prepositional phrase. At this point, I'm done guiding you through the sentences, and you will be on your own. Use the same process that we have in these first three to help you remember how to do the remaining sentences. Here's your next sentence. Pause the video, think about the items you need to come up with the correct form of the relative pronoun. If you said that the correct form of the relative pronoun in this sentence is quibus, congratulations, you are correct. Can you explain why? Let's see if your explanation matches mine. The relative clause starts at to whom and ends with freedom. The antecedent of whom is slaves, which is what makes it masculine and plural. To whom is the indirect object. I know it's the indirect object because the verb is gave, and the slaves did not do the giving, but something was given to them. That's what makes it the indirect object and why it must be in the dative case, and why quibus is the correct form of the relative pronoun. Pause the video while you find the relative clause, the relative pronoun, and determine its correct form in Latin. If you said that the correct form of the relative pronoun is quae, congratulations, you're correct. Now, let's take a look at why quae is the correct form. The relative clause begins at which and ends with boring. Which has as its antecedent stories, which is feminine and plural. This means that our relative pronoun must also be feminine and plural. Within the relative clause, which is the subject of the verb. I know it is because when I find the verb were, I want to know what were very long and boring. And of course that's the stories, and that's what which is referring to. So it is the subject of the sentence and must be in the nominative case. If you don't understand how to find the correct form of the relative pronoun within its clause, please make sure to come ask me now. Pause the video as you begin to determine what the relative clause is in this sentence, the antecedent of the relative pronoun, and what the correct form of the relative pronoun will be in Latin. If you said that the correct form of the relative pronoun whom in this sentence is quem, you are correct. Now, let's talk about why that is the correct form. First of all, the relative clause is whom many men call the greatest Roman poet. The antecedent is Virgil, so that means that the relative pronoun must be singular and masculine. Within its own clause, whom is the direct object. I know this because when I find the verb in the relative clause, which is call, I ask myself who did the calling, and that's the men. Who did the men call? The men called Virgil. Virgil is referring to whom, and so therefore it is the direct object, and that must be the accusative case. And that is why quem is the correct form. This is our final sentence to work with. Pause the video while you take the time to find the relative clause, the antecedent of the relative pronoun, and determine what the relative pronoun is doing in its own clause so that you can find the correct form of the relative pronoun in Latin. If you said that quem is the correct form of the relative pronoun, congratulations, you are correct. Let's make sure that your reasoning for why quem is the correct answer is also correct. When we read this sentence, we have to recognize that the relative clause begins with which and ends at built, the antecedent of which is horse. Horse is a singular and masculine noun, which means my pronoun must also be singular and masculine. When I look at the clause itself, I realize that the verb is had built. I ask myself who had built something, and the answer is they. Then I ask myself, what had they built? And the answer is a horse, or which. And that's why which has to be the direct object and in the accusative case. Well, you've made it through your first few examples of determining the correct form of the relative pronoun. Now we're going to test how well you really know what you're doing and ask you to explain to the class how to find the correct form of a relative pronoun. Are you up for the challenge? I think you are.